Hi, this is Rachel on Recover. We're back with Charissa Brim, and she's going to tell the rest of her story.
How has this impacted your marriage?
Yeah, it was in marriage that I kind of had to come to terms with what was happening, because I basically experienced the trauma and then went, about 7 years without really doing anything about it, like therapy or whatever. I had a couple sessions and then I ghosted a therapist, and that was that. And when you're in marriage, in like a safe, committed relationship, you can't hide all the parts of yourself that you used to be able to. You are, on display, for better or worse. And so I started getting triggered really bad, and I didn't even know that's what was happening. All I knew is that I was experiencing these things that I called rage blackouts. Like, I would get triggered, and then here comes the anger, and now I'm just like,
So
not even
disassociation,
present. I am
basically?
blacked out. Exactly. And it was in those moments that I was like, this isn't normal. Like, something's wrong. Something is not right. And that was really the catalyst to like get me into therapy and like really processing this piece of my story. And so, I mean, that's been really helpful, and helpful just to realize too that didn't mean that my marriage was bad. I I think kind of the opposite. Your brain and your body, it is protecting you. Like, that's one of its main goals. And so it shields you from a lot of the reality of your pain until you're in a place of safety where you can start to kind of process it and lay it all out on the table. And so, a lot of people, you find yourself in a safe relational setting, and then whoosh, here it all comes. So that was that was a huge part of our like early marital years, and trying to figure that out for both of us. How can we figure out how to heal from these triggers and also like be respectful of them and kind of create our own ecosystem.
Yeah. It sounds like he's very supportive of you.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to paint it in rose-colored glasses. Like, when it was happening, it was so hard. Like, I think he wanted to be supportive, and it was also, I just didn't have very good language to describe what I was doing. So it seemed like I was just all of a sudden acting like this version of a person he hadn't seen, didn't know like what's going on. And so it took a lot of I really have to applaud him for like the patience and resolve it took for him to walk through it with me while I figured out what the hell was happening. He didn't have to do that, and that was really impactful that he did.
I mean, I'm guessing your dating was much different than your previous relationships with your husband.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely. So kind of an interesting element of our story is I was very good friends with my husband in the year, like the couple years right after my assault. And so he witnessed my dating. So he saw me making a lot of choices that, wow, I wish he hadn't seen. So in some senses, that kind of fast tracked a little bit, because he had already his own account of what I was experiencing. And yeah, I kind of, reached a point after kind of my tumultuous dating that I realized this isn't serving me. This isn't benefiting me. This is contributing to a sense of identity that doesn't feel authentic with who I am. And so when I started kind of white knuckling that course correction is when our relationship really took off, and the rest is history. So
it sounds like it worked out, and it's
yeah.
it sounds like he's a good man.
Yeah, he definitely is. And
How has this impacted your reputation?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I think automatically in my mind, I kind of split it into two different types of answers. So how has it impacted my reputation? I think the first part is like the truth of how it actually did. And then I think there's a second part that's kind of the fear of, what I'm afraid it will, or like how I'm afraid it will impact my reputation. So as I've kind of alluded to so far in this conversation, the immediate aftermath was a mess. And I didn't understand what was happening to me. The people around me didn't understand. And when you are consumed in pain, even if you haven't like necessarily registered why or like the exact details of it, it's a normal response to look inward and become very self-focused, right? Like you're trying to devote all of your resources to fixing something that's not okay. But that also makes you kind of selfish. And I'm not necessarily putting a good or bad on that. I think it's just the reality is I wasn't really paying attention to what was going on around me, being reckless and, everything else with my behaviors. It was very different and very uncharacteristic of who I, typically and how I typically move through the world. And so unfortunately, it resulted in a lot of loss of relationships and friendships. And, I wasn't concentrating on school like I used to, and I wasn't, didn't have the bandwidth to show up to work like I normally did. And that definitely changed the reputation that I had. I was no longer this reliable, grounded leader that, I had been a couple months prior, which was intense to feel, and then the second kind of part of that, so that was like the reality, the truth of how it impacted my reputation. And that second piece, the fear, I think even present day, I write and podcast about sexual trauma. And when I first started doing that, I was so afraid that it was going to change how people thought of me. The reality is there's lots of stigmas around being a survivor. And I think I was afraid that people would think less of me, or, I tend to move through the world in a very like joyous and bubbly way. And I became really afraid that that piece of my reputation would be compromised, that people would think I was faking it or being inauthentic, or that wasn't real. And, the reality is survivors are full people. We have lots of different sides to us. And it's actually been really empowering in, the time that I've been public about this part of my story, to see that it hasn't led to that disconnection or an unfair reputation change. It's actually been, a source of connection. I think a lot of people resonate with just like the humanity of having experienced something terrible, but still moving on with life,
That's one of the reasons that Me Too movement has been so prevalent in this country, or around the world for that matter.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Because it's like you're not alone.
It's powerful to see.
And I think many of us suffer from isolation.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Is what kills us the most.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. That's where shame can get.
If you have been abused,
Yep.
tell it to yourself first before you tell it to anybody else. Perry Power told me that, and I did an interview with him. And I think that's the hardest part, because if you tell somebody you're not sure if they're going to believe you or not, and they don't believe you, it's harder to come again. So then
And if I could, and speaking from my own personal experience, it's almost the other side of that same coin. I had a number of people who it for me first and said, hey, what happened to you? Like, that's not okay. That's assault. That's rape. You know, like, they very much confirmed what it was, but I was still in denial. You know, like, I still hadn't, to use your words, like, I hadn't told myself. And so it didn't matter that other people knew or were aware, because until you believe it for yourself, you don't find resources that you need and pursue the help that you need. So it's important, like you said, for you to tell it to yourself first, for the confidence and the protection, and also because that's the only way that you can actually move forward in meaningful ways. Yeah.
Impacted your social life.
Yeah, I think, kind of what I previously said, I think it's a weird element to move through life knowing that you've had this experience, and, I think I've had an interesting scope of first thinking that no one has experienced this and I'm alone, and, dealing with it in isolation and feeling always a little bit like a fraud because people don't really know what had happened to me. And then since being just in a more public setting with this part of my story, like, now I've had the chance to hold in confidence that there's a lot of people that have had experiences, under this category. And, I think it's really confronting to see that with, like, the actual people around you. It reinforces the idea that, like, this is real, it happens to a lot of people, and the stigmas are not fair. It reinforces all those things that we know. I think I just have such a greater sense of respect and admiration for the women in my life. I think the more that I see resilience play out in my social settings, the more I'm just in awe at, like, the way we as humans figure out how to get back on the horse. It's really impactful. Yeah. Yeah. It's unfortunately hard, but it's really true. Yeah. I think that it's interesting, the timeline of my thought. It happened the summer before my senior year of college, and so that is a really, really pivotal time in life where you're making career choices, and so I was making those big choices in a trauma response. So there were a number of other things going on in life. I feel like traumas also happen in threes. Like, you're never just experiencing one thing. So I think it launched me into a career path that I don't know. It's not necessarily helpful to always, play the game of, like, what if, but there definitely seems to be a path that I was on, and then this happened, and I made a 90-degree angle turn. So I don't know. I think I'm still kind of coming to terms with the internal scattering that I felt and the external evidence of that, and trying to figure out how to take the reflections of that in my career and, make it make sense. I don't know if that even makes sense. But.
How has this impacted your faith?
This is a hard one because I am currently figuring it out, if I'm just honest. At times, it has brought me closer to my spirituality and has given me a, heightened sense of my dependence on the divine. But it has also made me aware of and unable to accept the realities that exist in a lot of religious settings. And so, I grew up in the church and grew up with a sense of like my own independent spirituality. So the two have always been connected for me. And so it feels really challenging to separate the two and figure out what is religion and what is spirituality and where does my faith fall within that. It's a lot of,
No, I mean, that
carefully
makes sense.
sifting through.
I mean, I don't know if you're going to church or not, but when you're ready, or if you want to, I would, check to see if it's a trauma-informed church, and I think that's becoming more prevalent when asking about a church.
Yeah.
Before going.
Yeah.
Or synagogue or whatever. Question.
Okay, perfect.
How has this impacted your physical health?
Yeah, so physically, we alluded to the book earlier, the body keeps the score, and that has been my experience. The body definitely does keep the score. There's a fairly large statistic of people who have experienced sexual trauma who then end up with an autoimmune disorder or disease. And I'm not a medical professional, so I can't say for sure, if that's the reason why, but I am one of those. I'm part of that statistic. I, about the same time, figured out that I was a celiac. And I think, I have since about 2012 been in some sort of a trauma response, and only in the last 5 or so years like really paid attention to my healing. And so the further along in my healing journey I get, the more aware of my body I am, so the more aware of my like physical health I have become. So I think I'm noticing that like I'm throwing my neck out all the time. I have back issues. I'm holding stress, like the body holds on to these things. And it's been a really interesting journey to just even clue into that,
Most definitely. I know so many survivors that are celiac or have an autoimmune.
So weird, huh? Yeah.
And it's just so incredibly prevalent. It's insane. What do you do for self-care?
Oh my goodness. I dance. I love dancing. that is my self-care. And it's not just because I like it, although obviously I do. It's actually been really important for me as I like process different like parts of healing. Because first of all, speaking of the body, it gets me back into my body. I tend to live in my head, just like floating through the world. And so dancing, kind of tethers me back to the present. It is playful, it's fun, and teaches me that I can feel safe paying attention to my body.
Okay. What would you like to say to encourage other survivors?
Yeah, I think if I could say anything, it would be that, your response to whatever trauma you're navigating, it makes sense. It's not always obvious when we are operating out of a trauma response, especially if we're like just trying to like get our footing in it. And in my experience, I think that's where I found a lot of self-shame. So there's a reason you're responding the way you are, even if it feels out of line or dysfunctional. And that's actually been so important to me that I created a little quiz, actually. So it helps you kind of figure out what your go-to responses are. That way you can direct your healing a little bit. So if any of your listeners want to check that out, it's if you go to my website, so it's charissabrim.com/quiz, and you can take it there.
Okay. Most definitely. What would you say was the most important piece of advice somebody gave you in your journey of recovering?
Yeah, I had a therapist tell me once that one of the like first things that I could let go of was this belief that healing from trauma happens on a timeline. That's just not how it works.
I would.
Yeah, something that happened 10 years ago, like it might be presenting itself in new ways now, and that doesn't mean you've been doing it wrong or you're not healing or that you'll never heal. It's, trauma kind of, I like to describe it as it staples your pant leg in the past, so you're physically present in the moment, but there's part of you that's, kind of constantly being pulled back, and you don't need to feel shame for that, for not getting over it quicker.
Yeah.
It's a journey.
All right. I think that's it. Anything else you would like to share that we have not hit on?
I think that's it. Thanks for questions that have led to like a lot of cool insights and verbally giving voice to our situations. That's important. So I appreciate it, Rachel.
All right. Thanks, guys, for listening. Tune in next Thursday at 10 a.m. And as always, follow us on your favorite podcast platform or social media platform. And if you have any questions, reach out to rachelonrecovery.com. Thank you.